the best Pokemon games by far were Heart Gold and Soul Silver. Now, I may be biased because these were the first Pokemon games I played, but on the other hand, your Pokemon get to walk behind you. Automatic 10 out of 10 right there. However, I've met a lot of people that think that the Generation 3 games, Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald, are far better than the Gen 2 remakes. I say if we want to make a fair comparison of them, then Pokemon need to be able to walk behind the player in a Gen 3 game as well. So that's exactly what I'm going to do now. I'm going to hack a Pokemon game to make Pokemon walk behind the player, and I'll show you how I do it. Also, stay tuned to the end for a surprise announcement about the release of this hack. Of the 3 original Hoenn games, I decided to create a hack of Pokemon Emerald since it was the capstone of that generation. Now, back in the day, Pokemon hacks, or hacks of any GBA game, were made by directly changing the binary of the file that was whatevergame.gba. Now, I'm not in that hard of a position since I have access to the complete source code of Pokemon Emerald disassembled back into the original C, which was created by the hardworking people over at Pret, who describe themselves as a band of dedicated fanboy misfits attempting to reverse engineer our favorite video games. Very big thanks to them and all their work. They've disassembled basically all the mainline Pokemon games up through Gen 3. They're the reason that hacks for these games have been so much easier to make. So after downloading the disassembly of Pokemon Emerald off of GitHub, I just ran a test compile to see if it would work, and it did. I got a clean copy of Pokemon Emerald. So then I made one slight modification to the game as another test. Let's see if you can catch what it is. Did you see that? That's right, I moved the bag one tile over to the right. Now, reading through the game code, I'm starting to understand how this is going to work, though I do have several options for getting Pokemon to walk behind the player. The first option, right off the bat, comes even before the starter is picked. The Zigzagoon that chases Professor Birch is already in the overworld and has 4 degrees of motion, but the problem is that this Zigzagoon is what is known as an event object in the game code. Essentially, it's the same kind of thing as an NPC. Now, that isn't necessarily something I can't work with, but the trouble comes from the fact that these event objects have their own section of sprite and palettes, separate from the Pokemon graphics data. But I want to pull this off without having to add any new sprites at all. How exactly am I going to have Pokemon walk behind the player without adding new sprites? It's not like Game Freak programmed it in already and just turned the feature off. Well, what I'm going to do is hijack an already existing sprite. My target is these sprites found in the PC and Pokemon Party menu. These 32 by 32 sprites of each of the 386 Pokemon in the game are called Pokemon Icons. Being 32 by 32, I think they would be a decent size relative to the player. But don't think I'm going to use these directly. They would look terribly out of place in the overworld. But it also turns out that 32 by 32 is exactly the same size as the Pokemon walking behind the player in Heart Gold and Soul Silver. So instead of creating new sprites for all 386 Pokemon, I can just import all of this artwork from that game into this one. Now, it isn't as simple as dragging all these Pokemon from that game over here, but luckily in the 13 years since the game has come out, the sprites have all been posted online, and I was able to find each frame of animation in separate PNGs. And after downloading all the images via a quick script, I used another script to stitch them all together into one file. So I have a complete PNG of each Pokemon Gen 1 to Gen 3 and a 32 by 192 image ready to go. As for getting these images into the game, the Pret disassembly, when compiled, does take a PNG of each Pokemon icon and creates a 4BPP file, that's 4 bits per pixel, which it then includes in the final .gba file, the game. But it can't just take any PNG. For it to include the image, it can't have more than 16 colors in it, because each pixel in the image is given a label of 0 to 15, again that's 4 bits per pixel. And what's more, if you want your image to show up with the right colors, each pixel must be numbered according to the right color label in the associated color palette file. Each Pokemon has their own unique palette, so their associated images, from their front to back, have to be formatted according to that palette. So I wrote out an algorithm to convert these RGBA PNGs into 4-bit per pixel images. In the Pokemon Graphics folder, I open each individual Pokemon folder and pull out 2 files, the color palette and the Pokemon icon. As a note, I convert this PNG into an RGBA PNG as well when it's imported. I then open the palette and place each color into an array. This is pretty easy since these palette files are actually just plain text. Then I take the Pokemon sprite file I crafted from Heart Gold and Soul Silver and stitch it onto the bottom of this icon image. Then each pixel is examined and replaced with a color from the palette which is its closest match, bringing the whole image to the correct 16 colors and giving these Gen 4 sprites a nice Gen 3 recoloring. I can then take all the resulting files, and when I recompile the game, the Pokemon icon has 6 secret frames of animation underneath it. So now all I need to do is get it to show up on the overworld. And after several days of frustration trying to get it to work, I finally added the correct few lines of code that triggers when the player walks outside, and there it is. Beautiful, isn't it? But now that I've got the Pokemon on screen, and I fixed it so you don't have to walk outside before it triggers, I have to make it behave like a Pokemon walking behind the player should. So opening Pokemon Silver, let's take a look at how Heart Gold and Soul Silver implemented the walking mechanic. In this game, Pokemon are always switching in between their 2 frames of walking animation. Then let me place a couple of bars around the player so that this next part becomes obvious. As I move around, the Pokemon only has 4 positions it moves to: north, east, south, or west of the player. When the player enters a building, they can't see their Pokemon behind them until they take a step, showing the Pokemon is following them into the building. Then my favorite, using the Pokeball. If the Pokemon was just in the Pokeball, then a Pokeball appears briefly on the ground in one of the 4 positions, and this animation is played. This happens whenever the player switches the order of the Pokemon in their party via the menu or PC, or when the player has just healed their Pokemon. Speaking of healing, it also happens in reverse there as well. The Pokemon will move into their Pokeball before all the Pokemon are healed. Of course, there are also a host of other times where the Pokemon simply disappear into their Pokeball as well, like when the player is surfing or getting on a bike. So these are all things I'm going to try to implement in Pokemon Emerald as well. Since I have all the animation frames, it isn't hard to create a simple function to switch between them. For those wondering why I don't just save some data and flip the horizontal back and forth, that might work well for some Pokemon like Entei, but others like Wurmple or Bird Pokemon have up and down animations, so flipping the horizontal wouldn't work. I need the 2 separate frames of animation here. Then implementing the 4 positions around the player was easy as well. The Game Boy displays a 240 by 160 image, and the player sprite is directly in the center of the screen and is 14 by 21 pixels in size. Since all our Pokemon overworld sprites are 32 by 32, I used a large Pokemon to find the ideal position to place them at, and depending on the movement of the player, snap them into that position. Then instead of a snap, I made it as smooth as I could to have them glide from one position to the next, while also changing their animation frames. And it's starting to look and feel really cool. Since some of the Pokemon are rather big, I can only get so close to the player on one side, leaving some smaller Pokemon looking farther away. Heart Gold and Soul Silver deal with this by having the larger Pokemon appear behind the player, something I did eventually wind up implementing, even though I really did like the look of bigger Pokemon being farther away. After I implemented it, the Pokemon follows the player on a 16 by 16 tile grid, and I was even able to get the Pokemon to jump in time with the player as they jump off the ledge. But there's one more thing I want to mention which requires a bit of an explanation about how GBA graphics work. The Game Boy Advance has 5 graphics layers. Think of it like 5 sheets of transparent paper placed on top of each other. 4 of these layers are background layers, and the other is a sprite layer which is capable of rotation, scaling, and other effects, nothing I'm going to use here today. Since these 5 layers are stacked on top of each other, whatever is closer to the top of the stack is shown as on top of the other layers behind it. This is how the player, NPCs, and houses all appear on top of the overworld map. So when I add the Pokemon to the overworld, I'm adding it to the same layer as the player's avatar. But I also have to keep in mind what is drawn onto the screen first in each layer. The concern here is that the player has a certain sub-priority, meaning that things like the top of the building will appear over the player, while the bottom of it will appear under the player. Likewise, the Pokemon walking around the player needs to appear under the player when it's behind the player, and on top of the player when in front of the player. So I have to find the right sub-priority to flip my Pokemon in between when it moves beyond a certain Y level, and after adding in that code, you can see the results look very natural. With the walking being finished, I could focus my efforts on creating animations with the Pokeball. I began with creating another sprite for the Pokemon's ball. I didn't just use a generic Pokeball like in Heart Gold and Soul Silver. Instead, I load up the specific Pokeball that each Pokemon was caught in, a detail I really wish was part of the Gen 2 remakes. Then I created animation rules so that when a certain variable is set and the player takes another step, the Pokemon is released. The same thing can happen in reverse too. For example, when the player goes to surf, get on a bike, or heal, then the Pokemon is taken back into the ball. Now, there were a few other issues I found during my debugging, one of the more significant being special overworld Pokemon, specifically the large kind, being namely Steelix, Lugia, Ho-Oh, Wailord, Groudon, Kyogre, and Rayquaza. Their sprites are about 48 by 48, not 32 by 32. Luckily, it just so happens that most of the sprites from the Rayquaza, Groudon, Kyogre scene are 32 by 32 pixels, so I can take some of their walking sprites from there for those three. And for the other animation frames and for the other Pokemon, I simply reduced the size of their Heart Gold and Soul Silver animations, some looking better than others. Ideally, I wanted to include the Lugia and Ho-Oh sprites from their special events that are already inside the game, but I'm not an artist, so whatever I would have made would have been 10 times worse than what I wound up with. So if there are any artists out there who want to create 4 more frames of animation for these 2 legendaries, I would be more than happy to put your work in this hack. Now, I did have to make a few sacrifices. Don't think that these upgrades came for free. The Game Boy Advance in this color mode can only hold on to 16 color palettes at a time, and sometimes all 16 are used up. I get around this by ripping out the last 2 and shoving my Pokeball and Pokemon palettes back in. It isn't clean to say the least, but I'm giving up the palette that's used for the sprite that makes it look like you're in the tall grass in exchange for overworld Pokemon. So I'm going to say that I'm getting the better end of the deal here. The other great sacrifice I made was with color. See, I've kept you in the dark until now, but the Pokemon icon, these images here, don't use the individual color palette of each Pokemon. Instead, they use one of 3 Pokemon icon palettes. It makes sense. I mentioned before that there can only be at most 16 color palettes in use at one time, and the PC has 30 Pokemon in a box, not to mention the 6 in the player's party. So when I recolored the Pokemon icon with the unique Pokemon palette, I screwed up the colors corresponding to the Pokemon icon colors. Now they don't appear quite like they should. So because I have all these colors messed up, I decided to change all the Pokemon icons to be black and white by replacing the Pokemon icon palettes with a black and white version. But you can see here that some of them look fine, while others are a bit off. To really make everything look right, I'll have to adjust my color algorithm to use the most optimal color corresponding to the black and white palette of these 2 sections up here. The resulting image looks weird as a PNG because this is shown with the unique Pokemon palette. Let's see how it looks in-game as black and white. Let's recompile, boot it up, and open up the party menu. Color. Okay, so I accidentally used the first colored icon palette instead of the black and white one I made. So my algorithm recolored the images according to this palette instead. We are missing some greens here, but it looks nearly perfect. Honestly, this is something that I should have done in the first place, but I'm glad that I accidentally did something right though. Now, there was a point where I realized that if I was going to put in so much time and effort to include Pokemon like Growlithe, Scyther, or the 28 forms of Unknown, that I wanted to be able to catch and see all of them in the game. So, the surprise announcement I mentioned earlier is this. I also created a randomizer version of this hack, where every wild Pokemon and trainer encounter is completely random every time. Something that only took me half a day and 4 lines of code to implement. So the vanilla version of my hack I'm calling Pokemon Emerald Ambulation, and the randomizer version, Pokemon Emerald Chaos Ambulation, both of which are available right now to download down below. This is the point where I need you to help me out. These hacks aren't perfect, and I suspect have some bugs or other defects. So if you use these hacks and come across a bug, then please send a screenshot and report via the links down below, and I'll do my best to patch it out. If you need help applying the patch to Pokemon Emerald, check out my video here. And if you want to see more programs like this, then don't forget to subscribe. And until next time, thanks for watching.